Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another live community classroom with Michaels. Today we have the wonderful Edie Ekman with us for another exciting class. We're going to be talking about the versatility of granny squares. My name is Renee from Yarn Inspirations. I'll be helping with any questions you might have during today's class. Please feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll make sure that Edie answers them. You can find Edie at Edie Ekman everywhere or edieekman.com. While we're getting started, please let us know where you're watching from, and if you've made a granny square before, what your favorite application is, let us know. I'm going to hand it back to you, Edie.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. So excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is granny squares. And of course, you know, some of us has waited years for granny squares to be hot again. They were maybe hot in the 70s when I was a young teenager. That tells you how old I am. And now they're hot again. So that's great. They are so great to work with. And there's so many ways that we can use granny squares. I'm going to start by talking about the, what is it called? Crochet Make a Blanket Statement, which is this awesome, beautiful blanket from Yarn Inspirations in these beautiful colors. And I'm going to talk a good bit about how it's made and how you can make it your own. And then I'm going to talk about some variations on granny squares. So different types of granny squares using different colors and maybe a few techniques that can make your granny squares look a little bit better. So it's not how to do a granny square, it's how you can change up your granny squares or the many ways you can use granny squares. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat because I want this to be a discussion. I'm going to be talking for an hour about granny squares. So I want to hear your questions and hear what's on your mind as far as granny squares go. So you see here, I have a few granny squares. I'm going to move these out of the way so I can take a close-up look at this Crochet Make a Blanket blanket. So as we look at a square, and I'm just going to pick this square right here, let's talk about what a granny square is. So a lot of people say granny square, and they mean any kind of square motif, like a square piece of crochet. Technically speaking, that's not exactly right. Just like a Kleenex, you know, Kleenex has come to mean any kind of facial tissue, but it could be a puffs or a, you know, something else. This is a granny square that's a true granny square, which is groups of 3 double crochets together, separated by spaces. So you have 3 double crochets, then a space. And as the granny square gets bigger, you have corners, and then you have some side spaces and some side groups. So the traditional granny square is what we're talking about. So let's just learn to read our granny square for just a minute. This particular granny square pattern has round 1, round 2, round 3, and round 4 in different colors. On Tuesday, we made granny squares all in one color, but you see it's the same idea. It's the groups and then the spaces. So it's the positive and negative that makes up the granny square, the positive stitches and then the negative spaces. So when we think of granny squares, a lot of times we think though of many different colors. So this one has a different color every round. So you would fasten off and then change colors. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that. So the other cool thing about granny squares is once you understand this pattern, which is its corner groups and then side groups, you can just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So let me scoot this blanket over. I'm trying to get it all in the camera here and not have it fall onto the floor. Well, here is a square that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rounds. So this is a big square that has 8 rounds, whereas this one has 1, 2, 3, 4. And not coincidentally, you'll notice that, let me see if I can get all this in the camera. Here's a 4-round granny and another 4-round granny. When you put them next to each other, it's the same width as an 8-round granny. Oh, so look, that means that we can do modules right? We can do little granny squares next to big granny squares. So now, Nate, if you can switch me, because I'm going to hold this up again so you can see it a little bit better. And what we've got, and if you have the pattern, you can certainly see this too. You've got the big granny square here, and then it's surrounded by these smaller granny squares. And then you have another big granny square. Can you see that? Another big granny square here in a different color, surrounded by the smaller granny squares. So you can do all kinds of arrangements of squares using the idea that depending on the number of rounds, that's going to make the sizes different. I could do another granny square that has even more rounds, that's even more giant. So I could start with a granny square. Ooh, that's hot. I'm going to take that off and put this back on underneath the camera. So I could start with a giant granny square that's even bigger. So think of a granny square that's blanket size and just has some little granny squares around the side as a border. So there's so many things you can do just with this one idea of grannies. Let's look at what this granny square blanket has as an edging. So recognize that this orange round is the last round of a granny square. But what do we have going on here? Can you see these granny stripes? The idea that it's groups of 3 double crochet and a space, 3 double crochet and a space. All of the double crochets, whether they are in the granny square itself or whether they're in a border, are worked into a space, not into a stitch. And I'm going to show you that in a few minutes when I crochet one. So you're always working into a space, which is awesome because it means you can go really fast. You're not trying to dig your hook into something. You're just sticking that hook right into the space. So a lot of times people can do this without really looking once you get comfortable with it. So here I have a border that's worked like the outside round of a granny square, and it's worked all the way around. So it sort of connects all of the blanket and goes all the way around. But it's the same thing. At each corner, I'm doing 3 double crochets, a chain space, and another 3 double crochets in the corner. So this whole width right here is not a granny square. It's like a granny stripe with a corner. Okay, so it's like one giant granny square, and then you get to another final border here. So that's it for this blanket in terms of the construction of the blanket or the arrangement of the blanket. If you look at the pattern, a lot of times granny square patterns, let me pull this up. This one actually tells you what you need to know in terms of the assembly. So it tells you the assembly diagram. It shows you the 4 big squares and then the little squares, and it has you sew the squares together. In this example, you're completing all these different squares. It tells you what colors to use and so on. And it has the chart. Of course, you can change your colors. You can mix it up. You may not like this colorway, although it's gorgeous. I don't know why you wouldn't want it. But let's talk about why these colors work so well. When you talk about color theory, there's something called analogous colors, and those are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So if you think of a color wheel, you can look one up online, and like the blues and greens are next to each other on the color wheel, and maybe the oranges are opposite each other on the color wheel. This particular blanket has a lot of analogous colors. You see the turquoise, the blue, the teal, the navy, whatever, are all analogous colors. You have some neutrals that pop up a little bit. This is a gray and this is a darker gray. And then of course you have the off-white. But this works because it's using a lot of colors that blend well together, but they're different enough that they're different colors. But then they're also using a contrasting color every now and then. Well, what do you think that contrasting color is? You see that orange popping out there? So just a little bit of a pop of color every now and then really makes this blanket work and be really interesting rather than just being, you know, all one color or all blue and white or whatever. I want to hold it up one more time so that you can see the whole thing and see where those pops of color happen. So when I hold this up in front of me, can you see the pops of orange in there and maybe the little pops of white, how they stand out and really highlight the other colors? So I just think this works so beautifully, and Yarn Inspirations is going to make me return it when this is over. And I'm really bummed about that, but you know, I could go and get some yarn and make one myself too. So
we're sorry.
yeah, I know it may be a little while before. Well, it's, you know, it's like 90 something degrees here today, so I don't really want it.
Lots of time to make one.
Right. So that is the Crochet Make a Blanket statement, and you have the pattern for that. I'm sure that that's been shared in your in the chat. So let's talk about this particular granny square that's used in this pattern. I'm going to start a granny square. Let's see. I don't think that blue is going to show up very well. Let's move to this orange. It's going to show a little bit better. This particular granny square. Now, I told you that granny squares are worked from the center out, and they're worked with chain spaces and groups of double crochet. The actual number of spaces and whether the corners are chain 2 or chain 3 can vary depending on the pattern. So this particular granny square pattern starts with a chain 5, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then join with a slip stitch to form a ring. And we're going to do the first round. This round starts with a chain 6 because it's 1, 2, 3 stitches. That's my first double crochet. That first chain 3 counts as a double crochet. And then I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, which will become my corner. So what I've got here really is a double crochet and a chain 3. Then into the ring, I'm going to work my next stitches. So see that ring right there where my finger's coming up? I'm going to stick my hook right into the ring because I am not working into a stitch. I'm not trying to work into a chain. I'm putting those 3 double crochets. Oops. Trying to go too fast here. These 3 double crochets right here. There's my first set. Now I need to do another corner. And by the way, I may hold my yarn differently from the way you do. That's fine. Or my hook. 3 more double crochets. So because I know how to do a granny square, I'm not really looking at the pattern except the beginning and ending of the round, because I just happen to know that this is using 3 chains in a corner and 3 doubles to make my sides. 1, 2. All right, so I've done 3 groups. I need to scoot these around. 1, 2, 3. Now the last group of this particular type of granny square, this particular pattern, remember when I started with my chain 3 that counted as a double crochet? That's actually the last double crochet of my next group. So here's what I mean by that. I've got 2 more double crochets. 1, 2. And then I'm going to slip stitch in the 3rd chain. 1, 2, 3. The 3rd chain here to finish that group. So that first chain 3 was actually the last of this group of 3 stitches. So there's my round 1. I can fasten off here if I want to, or I can go with the same color. The pattern is going to tell you to do this and then do the next color. Let's make it green. Oops, there's the end of my yarn. Do the slip stitch with the next color and do my chain 3 to start the next round. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. This is not going to be in the pattern. This is my secret way to make things better, but let me show you how the pattern has you do it first. So that chain 3 is needed to get your hook up to the next round, right? We started a new color. We're going to come up here. We're going to do another chain 3. Again, according to the pattern, put 3 doubles, 1, 2, oops, 3. Now I need to bridge the gap over these 3 doubles. So I'm going to do a chain 1. And by the way, I should have cut this yarn. I don't want that there. And do a corner here. And let me get around this round real quickly, because I want to show you how I fasten off and start a new color in a way that I like better than what this pattern suggests. And a lot of times, if you know another way to do something, the pattern may not tell you how to do it, but if you happen to know a better technique, you know, there's no crochet police. Nobody's going to come along and say, wait, you didn't do it exactly the way the pattern says. The pattern says to do this. Well, that's why you're making it your own, because you know a better technique, or a technique that's going to look a little bit better in your opinion. Okay, I'm just chit-chatting to fill time. Here we go. There's another corner, another chain 1 space, another corner. Now this pattern uses a different color on every single round, which means I'm fastening off at the end of every single round. So I have to finish with a chain 1. Now, remember, I need 2 more double crochets here in this first space to make that first group. And I'm not super happy with that technique, but that's okay. We're doing what the pattern says. And then join with a slip stitch to the top of that first chain 3. Now I'm going to fasten off here. I'm going to leave a long enough tail. That's about a 6-inch tail, because I want to have enough to weave in. If I don't weave in long enough tail, I'm going to be sorry, but I'm going to fasten this off. Now, remember that chain 3 I did that needed to get my hook up to the level of the next round? Well, now my hook's not attached at all, but that's okay, because I can start in any corner. What if I don't want my corners to start in the same place all the time, because I find it hard to weave in all those ends all on the same corner? What if I want to start over here on this corner? Well, I can do that. All I have to do is start with a slip knot on my hook. I just put a slip knot on my hook right there. And I'm going to just do a double crochet into that corner. Remember, we're working into the space. This is called a standing double crochet. And there it is. It's just double crochet. It's standing up there all by itself. And I can go ahead and do my round, and I can start it really anywhere I want. Oops. And go on around. So I like to fasten off with the slip stitch and then start my new round every time that's a new color with a standing stitch. Notice that that double crochet does not look like a chain 3. So if I start every round with a new color and use a standing stitch, there's not going to be a chain 3 that looks different, right? The chain 3 masquerades as a double crochet, but it's not really a double crochet, but this really is a double crochet. So as you work around, and you fasten off, you aren't going to be able to find the beginning of the round if you use this technique. And you don't have those little slip stitches. You don't have that little awkwardness over here where you had the chain. Look at, you see how that chain's kind of, it doesn't look as much like a stitch as these do. This solves that problem. So that is an unwritten bonus technique that you learned because you came to class with me today. Okay, so I use standing stitches to change color every time. There are ways you can continue working in the round. And if I were going to do the same, let me back out here a minute. If I were going to keep the next round green though, let me undo this. I would have done exactly what the pattern says, which is slip stitch in this space and then do my chain 3 and continue working around if I were keeping the same color. So I would not be using the standing double crochet. If I were keeping the same color, I would be using my chain 3. So just to be clear with that. If anybody has questions about that, they can find me on social media, and I've got some videos about it. And I know Yarnspirations has a lot of techniques as well. They have a granny square, how to do granny squares. So I'm sure that Renee is putting that in the chat at some point.
I can pop that in the chat. Do you have time for a few questions, Edie?
Sure, absolutely.
Cool. Leslie asked, does Edie plot out colors and pattern in advance, or do you work ad hoc?
Yes.
Yes to both.
Yes to both. So sometimes it's going to be planned. Usually the colors are going to be planned in that, yes, I know these colors go well together. You know, that I want my piece to be made out of these, I don't know, 5 colors or whatever. But the actual, like down to the which color is this round going to be, I'm not necessarily doing that. I'm probably, you know, just doing whatever I feel like, because that's a little bit too much planning. Like I like to be somewhere between super planny and not planning at all. If there's a place for that, there's a happy medium. So, but sometimes, yeah, I do. Sometimes I'll actually like draw it out using digital tools. I'll make one and I'll do like a little Photoshop or Canva arrangement to see what they look like, because you don't have to actually make all the things. You can, you know, use them like puzzle pieces. I've even done it with making color copies. Like I make 2 or 3 granny squares, actual granny squares in the colors, make color copies, cut them out, and then put them together like I'm in kindergarten, you know, like arrange my colors that way. So that's another way you can do it.
Awesome. Bren asked, what do you do with the green tail where you changed color?
So here,
we're backing up a little bit.
Yeah, there we go. So here I have a bunch of tails because I ended with the orange and I started with the green, and I'm going to get a yarn needle and weave that in. And I can show you that. Let me reach over here and get a yarn needle. Hang on. So I wouldn't do it now because I'm still working on my square, but I definitely want to make sure it comes to the back. And then I want to weave it in really carefully. Now, some people are just going to work over their yarn tail and say that's good enough. I say it's not good enough. I say you really need to weave it in a couple of different directions. So definitely leave a 4 to 5 to 6 inch tail. If you're working with ginormous yarn, you want to leave a longer tail. So I'm going to weave it in at least 2 inches back and forth, up and down, around, or whatever, and then cut it off. That wasn't 2 inches worth, but then I'm just going to cut it off. Same thing here with this beginning tail. You can see there's my little slip knot. I'm going to work it under the stitches in one direction, but I'm definitely going to go back in another direction and weave in plenty. You will be sorry if you don't leave a long enough tail. And I said that in the class on Tuesday too. Just believe me that you definitely want to weave it in sufficiently. So yeah, when you're doing granny squares, unfortunately, there are two tails every time you use a color. And I have not figured out a way to keep from having a beginning tail and an ending tail. And a lot of people hate weaving in ends. And I just think of it as part of it. So part of my, like, how do you deal with ends? Like, how do you deal with them mentally? It can be a challenge. So I just think of it as part of it. It's not part of the crocheting. It's something different, but it's what you need to do to make it look good. If you sew, you know how you end up with all those little bits of thread that you have to cut eventually? It's just part of it. Or if you think about cutting the grass, like if anybody has a lawn and the grass gets really big and you hate to cut the grass, but then when you cut the grass and it's so beautiful, it makes you so happy. That's the way I feel about my granny square ends, that I can just, yeah, it's a mess back there, but once I clean off a little bit of it, it looks so nice. I'm ready to keep going. So that's my mental trick for weaving in ends on granny squares. Yeah.
Awesome. So Miriam asked, do you have any tips for keeping your squares that are supposed to be the same size from not getting bigger or smaller? So how do we keep them consistent?
Okay. So the first thing to realize is that if you are using the same size hook and the same size yarn, the same yarn, so not the same size yarn, but the actual same yarn. So if you're using Red Heart Super Saver, which is what I'm using here, and a size, what is this? I can't see it. Is that a J hook? I can't, I9, 5.5 millimeter hook. My granny, and I'm using the same pattern, my granny square should be the same size. So as I make granny squares and use different size hooks, I'm going to get different size granny squares. So these two granny squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, were made with different size hooks. It's the same yarn. You see the difference in size? So you need to make sure you're sticking with the same hook and the yarn is the same size, the same yarn. Now, if I were doing some of these granny squares in Super Saver and some in Red Heart with Love, even though those are both number 4 yarns, medium worsted weight yarns, the way the yarn slips through the hook may be a little bit different. So even if you do 4 rounds, it might be slightly different. The hook and the yarn combination might be slightly different, even with the same quote unquote size yarn. So either stick with the exact same yarn, just in different colors and the same hook, or if you're going to use multiple types of yarn, then you need to adjust your hook size to get them to be the same size. So I hope that answers, and whoever asked that question, if that didn't answer, please ask in the chat again, and I can kind of discuss that a little bit more if I need to. Right. Were there any other questions? Yeah.
On the similar note, Leslie asked, keeping the size the same is also dependent on tension, is it?
Yes, absolutely. And the tension, I don't like people to think of tension as being what they're, like tension. I hate that name. It's like, the flow, the work, the way it goes through your fingers. With practice, your tension, your gauge is going to be consistent. As long as you're using a consistent hook. And when I say the same hook, I mean the same hook. I don't mean this is, a Susan Bates 5.5 millimeter, and you're going to use some other brand 5.5 millimeter. It needs to be the same hook because that affects your gauge as well. So yeah, the tension is going to be, if you're using the same hook and the same yarn, your gauge should be the same, because that's how you adjust it. So if you think it needs to be different, you want to change your hook size. Okay.
Awesome. Sorry, just going through the chat quick here. One thing I did want to chat about, and we mentioned this on Tuesday, while we're talking about the shape of squares, can you tell us about skewing grannies? Can you
Yeah.
explain what that means?
Skewing granny. So I don't really have an example of a skewed granny right here. But what happens as you get bigger with your square, it may start to skew. It may start to kind of look like it's going to rotate. And actually, if you look at enough granny squares, big granny squares online, you will see that they kind of do this. And actually, I noticed it a little bit in this photo. If you, and I don't know if you can see it, I don't know if you can tell that that square right there, that big one, is a little bit off square. Does that make sense to you? It's a little bit tilty. So what happens is, if you're right-handed, it starts to skew this way. If you're left-handed, it starts to skew this way. And by the way, I didn't mention I'm right-handed and I work granny squares in this direction. If you're left-handed, you're going to work in this direction. Okay. So what I end up doing to keep it from skewing like that is I will work, let me back this one out a little bit. Every few rounds, I will work my corner as chain two double crochets, chain 3, and then 4 double crochets. 1, 2, 3, 4. So, and you would do that on every corner, just every few rows. And what that does is it resets your corners. Another thing that you could do if you didn't want to do that is you can work one round in this direction and then turn and work the next round in the opposite direction. So you would have a right side round, a wrong side round, a right side, wrong side. So you'd be going in opposite directions, joining and going around. So you wouldn't have, like this has all right side rows here, all wrong side rows here. You would have alternating right side and wrong side rows. So Renee, are there more questions or can I keep talking about some other things with grannies?
You can go right back to grannies, and
Okay.
everyone, if you have questions, just pop them in the chat. I'll store them in my brain, and then I will return to Edie with more questions.
Okay.
Cool.
So we don't have to just do squares. You know how I said, well, let's talk about squares. We'll keep talking about squares and then we'll talk about some other shapes. So I said, this is a traditional granny square. It's the 3 double crochets and the corners, and it's square. Some people call granny square, any square, a granny square, but there are variations on granny squares. So here's a blanket that I did a few years ago. Let me show you the right side of the blanket, not the wrong side of the blanket. And here you can see these are traditional granny squares. Note the analogous colors and the pop of color here. But here's a square that's not a granny. You see it's very lacy. It starts with a little flower, but it looks like it starts like a granny square and then it gets lacy. Or here's one that starts as a circle and becomes a square. So I call these motifs. They aren't traditional quote unquote granny squares. They are square motifs. Here's another one that's a square motif. However, people will call these granny squares, but I'm just trying to make sure that you understand there is a technical difference between what is a granny square and what is a square motif. But most people are actually going to say, oh, look at that beautiful granny square blanket. And it's not granny squares, but that's okay. I have Kleenex on my desk right now. And it's not really Kleenex, right? Or magic marker. Remember magic markers? And now we call them Sharpies, but the magic marker was another one. Okay, so those are squares, but they aren't granny squares. But we can have granny other things, like let's name some other shapes. Can you name a shape rather than a square? How about a hexagon? So here I have granny hexagons. So if you look at this real carefully, let me put it under the camera here. These are not groups of 3 double crochet, they're groups of 2 double crochet. Can you see that's just 2 double crochet? But it's still the same idea. I've got basically 6 sides, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Instead of 4 sides, I'm changing color every round, and I've got corners. So here's a corner, looking at the pink. Here's a corner, and I've got the groups along the side, and they're all worked into the spaces. I know that gray is a little bit hard to see, but I'm working into spaces, not into stitches. So this is a granny hexagon that's put together. This happens to be join as you go here along the sides, and it makes a cowl. So I can put my cowl on, they can switch it back, and it makes a nice, there we go, makes a nice cowl. And you can do this with, you know, any, I didn't have to use all the same color matching yarn. I could have done this as a wildly different colors or whatever if I wanted to. Okay, what about, I'm going to switch back here. What about triangles? These are not maybe traditional grannies, but you can make granny triangles. I don't have a traditional granny triangle. This is a triangle motif, but you can put them together as triangles. You can use other squares. Again, not grannies. These aren't grannies, but this is another cowl that has a flower motif. So once you have the idea, you can just use motifs for all kinds of things. And even garments. So this is a fabric that I created. Again, not traditional granny squares, but it could have been traditional granny squares. Can you see those are individual little squares that are joined together, and they created a garment. So you can certainly make all kinds of things, and you can see patterns these days for vests that have one giant granny square on the chest. I'm sure you've seen those. We had those again in the 70s. I think I had one of those vests that had the giant granny square on the chest. So, and one more I want to show you here. Here's a different blanket. Again, not granny squares. This was a completely scrap blanket. So, but these are hexagons, but they could have been granny hexagons. They just happened to be not. It was a completely scrap blanket. I'm going to hold this one up because the person who asked the color, about colors, this is one where I just had leftover yarns, and I'll hold it up so you can see it. I had tons of leftover yarns in these sort of pastel-y colors, and there was no planning whatsoever. It was just, I knew they all went together, and I just made a bunch of hexagons, and I think it worked really well. So don't be afraid to do that. Just make sure the yarns go together before you start. And they were all the same weight. They were all just worsted weight wool yarns. Okay. All right, let me stop for a second and take a drink and see if there's some other questions.
Awesome. So Donna asked, how do you put the granny squares together to make a blanket? So can we talk about how we join it?
Yes. So there are many different ways to join. The Yarnspirations blanket that I showed you at the beginning is sewed together. So if I show you here, they whipped stitched these stitches together using just the outer edge of the square. So you can see that it left a little bit of a decorative ridge right here and right here. So that's one way to do it, is to whip stitch. And they used this green color, it looks like, for everything. One thing you can do if you don't want it to show like that is they could have used the orange or the turquoise, and that wouldn't be quite as visible. Okay, so that's one way you can do it. You can also single crochet them together. So I'll do that here with a couple of squares that aren't the same size. Remember, I said there's a problem. They're not the same size. We're just going to pretend they're the same size, because you would want, these are a little closer to being the same size. You would want them to be the same size. And I'm going to use a different color yarn so you can really see it. So if you wanted to single crochet them together, you could either put them with right sides together, like this, and just single crochet to create a seam, working under both strands. Now, when you single crochet together to create a seam, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm having a little bit of an issue here. That single crochet seam is going to be quite visible. And you see I'm doing a contrasting color, but that might be good. I might be doing that on purpose because I want it to be decorative. If I hold the pieces with right sides together and do the seam, the right side of the blanket is going to look like this. But I could have chosen to hold it with wrong sides together like this. And again, watch me do a standing single crochet here. Now I'm going to hold it with wrong sides together and do that same seam here. And when I do that, I'm going to end up with a ridge on the right side of the fabric. And that may be pretty and decorative in what I want, but just know that when you single crochet together, you're going to get a little bit more texture here. But then there's also something called join as you go, which is definitely should be the subject of a different class. It's my favorite way of joining. And when you do join as you go, you actually join one square to another as you work. So you work the entire piece and then you join it to the other piece. And I can show you on this blanket what this looks like. I can show you actually on this blanket, I've got several examples of putting things together. Let me put the glasses on so I can figure out which way I did it. So, all right, so these granny squares were worked with the join as you go method. So as I did the final round of green, I joined it to the previous one, and you can see that there's no seam there. There's just a little bit of a gap there. On others, oh, here's another join as you go. Let's see. This one was join as you go. Some of these were sewn, but I can't remember which. All right, here's another example of a granny square that was join as you go, but this one had a little bit of a lacy border on it. So there are just so many different ways you can do it. These were actually done with a single crochet 2 together and a chain 3 space between them. So can you see that seam? It was single crochet 2 together, chain 3, single crochet 2 together in those spaces, and that creates this look. So there are just so many different ways. You can join as you go, you can sew, or you can single crochet together. They all have different benefits. And as I say, I can't really go into like every different way. I've written whole books about this. So we only have a few minutes left, but join as you go is definitely a good way to do it. And there are lots of, you do have to plan a little bit though. So if you're planning your placement for colors and you're planning to do join as you go, you probably have to give it a little thought, a little more thought than you would if you're going to sew things together later. That was a long answer to a, you can sew it, you can join as you go, or you can crochet it together. That was the short answer.
Well, it's good to know all the different options. That was great.
Other questions?
I think there was a throwback here when we were talking about the square motif.
Mm-hmm.
Janet, do you want to hop in the chat and just give me a few more details about that question? If she is still here. Okay, we'll keep going. Edie, just a question from my own personal curiosity. What do you think the staying power of granny squares is? Like, we've had them in the 70s, we have them now. What do you think keeps us loving them so much?
Well, you know, if I had to, like, yes, we had them in the 70s, maybe we had them in the 60s. I was not aware of like crochet in the 60s, but I think that they're going to come and go out of fashion, right? But they've never really gone away. And I think the reason for that is, I think there's several reasons for it. One, it's so easy to do once you learn the granny stitch. In other words, the group, the space, the group, the space, how to do a corner, whatever. You can do so many things. You can make it giant, you can change colors, you can play with color, play with shapes, all within the same stitch pattern. So you're not like having to learn a new stitch pattern every time. You just, you can make little ones, you can make big ones, you can make medium-sized ones, you can use up your stash, you can buy more yarn. Like if you see beautiful yarns in different colors and you say, oh, what could I make with this? You can always make a granny square project. So, and everybody of all ages loves them. So, what's better than a nice granny square blankie that matches your decor and, your living room and your bedroom and your son's bedroom and your daughter's bedroom and your granddaughter's bedroom and your, you can just make them forever. So I'm not sure that fashion wise, like wearables wise, they're going to necessarily stay in for very long. Like I say, that, the one I'm talking about, the big granny square that goes on your chest and it has a couple little things here. Like I'm sure I had one of those in 1975. They're back in, but it's not necessarily a look I'm going to wear now, or that people are going to be wearing 3 years from now. I'm guessing.
I think it's timeless personally, but
okay.
So Kim had a question. Sorry, we have a few questions here asking about rectangle granny squares, or I guess that would that be called a granny rectangle?
It would be called a granny rectangle. It would be. And to do a granny rectangle, you basically start, instead of starting in the round like this, you're going to start, I don't know if I can do one off the top of my head, but you're basically going to start with a chain. Don't quote me on this because I wasn't prepared for it, but you're going to start with a chain and you're going to do, it's not long enough. You're going to do your groups of 3, 1, 2, 3, chain 1, and then maybe another group of 3. And so you're going to do along one side of the chain, and then you're going to do a corner and another corner, and you're going to work along the other side of the chain and do a corner and a corner. So instead of starting with a circle, you're starting with a little rectangle, a little chain. You're working around here. And then as you go out, you still have the corners, but one side of the rectangle is going to have more of these side pieces than the other. So imagine cutting this in half and stretching it out. You're going to have more groups along this side than you are along this side. So yes, absolutely, you can do a granny rectangle. I looked before we started class. I have a pattern for granny rectangle scarf, and I couldn't find the actual scarf because I would have showed it to you. So, okay, other questions?
Hang on a second. Vicky asked, do you use 2 or 3 chain for your corners?
It just depends. So a lot of times this particular pattern uses 3 chains, okay, and chain 1 spaces. There are patterns that use chain 3 corners and no spaces. You just work between the groups of double crochet. That's the one we did Tuesday night. Sometimes I will start with a chain 3 corner and then work chain 2 corners. I find for the way that I work, if I put a chain 3 corner in for every corner, my piece starts getting a little too long at the corners and it gets super pointy. So if you notice that your granny square is starting to do this, you want fewer chains in your corners. You want it to, make them smaller. But if you find out it's too rounded, and you notice these are a little bit rounded, but that's the way I like them. If it's too rounded, you want more chains in the corner, 1 more chain. But remember, each chain you add is actually adding 4. So I find usually chain 3 corners get a little too pointy like this. It really just depends on what your gauge is and how you work. By the way, remember, you don't have to 100% follow a pattern. Read your work and see what it looks like, and then make adjustments. If you're getting that skewing, make an adjustment. Even if the pattern doesn't say so, you're smart enough to make the adjustments you need to make your piece look awesome, right? And by the way, I think we should be calling this the awesomeness of granny squares, not the versatility of granny squares. But I don't know, that maybe marketing was like not the awesomeness of granny squares.
Well, they're awesome because they're versatile and you can
There
use
you
them in
go.
so many
There you go.
things.
Right.
We have some people asking about how to finish the project. Now, we're not going step by step on this pattern necessarily. How would you go about finishing it?
So that's actually a great question, because I can talk about it in generalities. Let me pull the blanket back here again. So the first thing you're going to do is weave in your ends. All your ends, weave them all in. You can either wait till the end, or you can weave them in, you know, as you finish a square, and different people are going to have different opinions about whether they want to do that. If you're really smart, you can teach your school-age children to weave in ends. My children had been known, when I was on deadline, to be given a yarn needle and a pair of scissors and told to weave in the ends. And, you know, they knew how to do that. They didn't necessarily know how to crochet, but they knew how to weave in ends. So you want to weave in your ends, and you want to block your squares. You want to block really carefully. If you're using acrylic yarn, you want to be careful not to melt your acrylic, not to kill your acrylic. So you want to handle it correctly. So you're going to block all your pieces, because you want them to be flat and smooth. You never iron, by the way, never touch an iron or heat to your piece. You use steam or water to let it, to block it. So, and by the way, I do have a link for blocking, Renee. I don't know if that's something, you can look at my website and find it. I have a blog post about blocking knit and crochet. All right, so you weave in your ends, you block all your pieces, you sew them together, or you crochet them together, whatever you decide to do. Then you're going to work the edging, and this edging goes all the way around. You see, it goes all the way around. So those are some ginormous rounds. When you get to when you do however many rounds those are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then there's a row of, it looks like double crochets and single crochets and single crochets, and then another edging. So you just follow the instructions for the edging. Weave in your ends again, and then I would probably block the edges one more time, since this part hadn't been blocked, but I would always want to block my squares before I sew them together. It's just easier. You can check that they're the same size. You can check for errors. You know, when you're blocking, you're kind of checking to make sure there are no mistakes. So you can check all that while you're blocking. So hopefully that's the answer of how you finish the project. So this was great. Want to thank everybody. I may have time for another question or two, but you can always find me on YouTube and find me at my website. I have lots and lots of information about granny squares and putting things together and so on. And Yarnspirations has videos as well on how to make granny squares. And I'm sure lots of other information. Renee has probably put in links on the chat when I haven't been paying attention.
Yeah, we have many links. There's lots of places, lots of great resources.
Yeah.
And as everyone has mentioned, we can watch this video later if you guys want to go over everything again.
Absolutely. So I hope I will hear from people, see people again at another Michael's class. And I hope that you really enjoy the versatility of granny squares, whether you make this beautiful, it's so soft and beautiful, this beautiful blanket, or something else with your granny squares. If you do, please share hashtags. Somebody else is going to tell me what those hashtags are.
Hashtag Yarnspo, and Nate, I believe it's hashtag Make It With Michaels.
Awesome. And if you want to hashtag Edie Ekman, then I'll know that you saw me here.
Yeah. Awesome. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this live community classroom with Michaels. Don't forget to share your work with the hashtags Make It with Michaels and Yarnspo. It's a little tricky for spelling, so it's YARNSPO. And just a reminder, you can find more classes on michaels.com and a recording of today's class at michaels.com/classes. You can find Edie at edieekman.com, and her handle on all socials is at Edie Ekman. All good. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.